The Arizona Territory in 1878 was a crucible. It forged souls in fire and baked them in the unforgiving sun, and it broke more than it ever made. For Josephine Gable, it was meant to be a promised land, a new beginning bought with sweat and prayer. But the trail west doesn't care for promises. It demands a price. When her own kin left her for dead in the dust of the Dragoon Mountains with a broken body and a shattered spirit, her story should have ended. It should have been a whispered tragedy, another unmarked grave claimed by the desert. But the desert sees all, and sometimes, in its harshest corners, it offers the most unlikely salvation. This is the story of that salvation, of a love born not in a church, but in the shadow of death itself. The sun was a merciless god hammering the cracked earth of the Arizona Territory into a shimmering anvil. For Josephine Gable, it was a funeral pyre. She lay at the bottom of a shallow, rocky arroyo, the world a dizzying swirl of dust motes, and the piercing, indifferent blue of the sky. The last sound she had truly registered was the fading rumble of the wagon wheels, the wagon that carried her brother-in-law, Silas Kane, and the last remnants of her old life. It had happened so fast. 1 minute she was walking alongside the wagon to spare the weary mules, her heart a leaden ball of grief for her husband, Jedediah, buried 200 miles back after the cholera took him. The next, a loose rock, a cry of surprise, and a blinding, searing pain as her leg twisted beneath her, the snap of bone, a sickening crack in the afternoon stillness. Silas had hauled her up his face, a mask of grim impatience. A clean break, he'd pronounced, his voice devoid of sympathy. We can't stop Josephine. The Apaches, the water, we're a week from Fort Bowie. The others in their small party of 3 wagons had gathered around their faces, etched with pity, but also with a raw, desperate fear that overrode everything else. Martha, a weary woman with kind eyes, had offered a strip of linen for a bandage. But Silas was the leader now that Jedediah was gone. His word was law. She'll slow us to a crawl. Silas had argued, his voice, low and venomous, meant only for the adults. We'll all die out here for one woman. He looked down at Josephine, his eyes as cold and grey as river stones. Jedediah would have wanted us to save the children, to see this through. He used her husband's name like a weapon against her. Jedediah, a man of profound kindness and strength, would never have countenanced this. He would have carried her on his own back if he had to. But Jedediah was gone, and in his place was his brother, a man whose ambition was a cold, hard thing, unburdened by compassion. Josephine had pleaded not for herself, but for the memory of her husband. Silas, please, just a day, to set the bone. A day is a lifetime out here, he'd snapped. He'd ordered them to leave her the half-empty canteen, a single biscuit, and the threadbare blanket from her marriage bed. It wasn't an act of mercy, it was a performance for the others, a way to soothe their meager consciences. He was leaving her to die, but with the semblance of care. She watched them remount. She saw Martha look back, her face, a portrait of helpless sorrow, before her own husband pulled her forward. And then there was only the creak of the wagons, the jingle of harnesses, and Silas's voice urging the mules onward, a sound that would haunt her dreams for whatever time she had left. Now, hours later, the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. The pain in her leg was a living thing, a fire that licked its way up her body. Thirst was a claw in her throat. She tried to move, to drag herself to the sliver of shade offered by a gnarled mesquite root, but the agony was blinding. She collapsed back into the dust, a sob catching in her throat, dry and rasping. She clutched the small, tarnished silver locket around her neck. It had been Jedediah's wedding gift. Inside was a tiny, painstakingly painted portrait of him, his kind eyes seeming to look right at her. She'd snapped it open, her fingers trembling. "Oh, Jedediah," she whispered to the unhearing desert, "you promised we'd build a home, a life." But the promise was as dead as he was. Her future was this dusty arroyo, this merciless sun. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the air grew colder. The desert that burned by day froze by night. She pulled the thin blanket tighter, her teeth chattering. The coyotes began their yipping, lonely chorus in the distance, and she knew other predators would soon be on the move. She was no longer a settler, a wife, a woman with a future. She was just meat, a forgotten soul waiting for the end. She closed her eyes, the image of Silas's cold face, the last thing in her mind, and prayed for it to be quick. The world had shrunk to a fevered haze of pain and thirst. Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness, each waking moment a fresh wave of agony. The sun rose again, hotter and more hateful than the day before. The buzz of flies grew bolder, and in the sky above she saw the slow, patient circling of a vulture. It knew. The desert always knew. She had given up. The will to fight had been baked out of her, leaving only a hollow resignation. Her lips were cracked, and bleeding her tongue, a swollen foreign object in her mouth. She had licked the last drop of dew from the inside of the canteen hours ago. This was it. The end of the line for Josephine Gable. It was then that a shadow fell over her. Her first thought was that it was a cougar or perhaps a bear. She flinched, a pathetic, weak movement, but the shadow remained still. Slowly fighting through the fog in her brain, she forced her eyes open. Standing over her was a man. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sinewy strength that comes from a life lived on the land. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth, his black hair long and tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, and his chest was bare, save for a small medicine bag hanging from his neck. His face was stark and angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and intelligent, and they watched her with an unnerving intensity, missing nothing. He held a simple wooden bow in one hand and had a quiver of arrows on his back. An Apache. Fear primal and cold lanced through her, momentarily eclipsing the pain. All the stories she'd heard around the campfire, tales of raids of merciless warriors of a savage people who hated the white settlers encroaching on their land, crashed down on her. She was a dead woman, one way or another. He knelt, moving with a silent grace that was almost unnerving. He made no sudden moves, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were calming a frightened horse. He reached out not for her, but for the empty canteen beside her. He shook it, heard the hollow sound, and his lips tightened into a thin line. Josephine tried to speak, to beg, but only a dry croak emerged. The man looked from her face to her grotesquely swollen and angled leg. His expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, not pity, perhaps, but understanding passed through his dark eyes. He saw her torn dress, the single blanket, the pitiful biscuit. He saw a person who had been left behind. In this land, that was the ultimate sin, a judgment worse than any other. He stood, and for a moment Josephine thought he would leave her just as Silas had. Her heart seized. But he only walked a few paces away to where a scruffy horse was tethered patiently waiting. From a pouch on its flank, he retrieved a water skin. He returned and knelt beside her again. He uncorked the skin and, supporting her head with a hand that was surprisingly gentle, he tipped a small amount of water onto her lips. It was the most exquisite sensation she had ever felt. It wasn't just enough to moisten her mouth to remind her body what it was to live. He did it again, slowly, patiently, not letting her gulp and choke. When she could finally swallow properly, he spoke. His voice was low and resonant, the words utterly foreign. He was asking her something she was sure of it, but she could only shake her head feebly. He then turned his attention to her leg. His touch was clinical, impersonal. He examined the break with a practiced eye. Josephine braced herself for more pain, but he was careful. After a moment, he looked back at her and spoke a single word in broken, heavily accented English. Alone. The word, simple as it was, broke through her delirium. It encompassed everything: the betrayal, the hopelessness, her impending death. Tears, hot and thick, finally spilled from her eyes and traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She nodded a single sharp jerk of her chin. The Apache scout watched her for a long, silent moment. He could leave. It would be the easy thing to do. She was a Pinda-Likoye, a white-eye. Her people were his enemies, the ones who drove the deer from the forests and the buffalo from the plains. Helping her could bring him nothing but trouble. But he had seen the vulture. He had seen the wagon tracks heading east with no sign of a stop, no sign of a camp. He recognized the particular cruelty of this abandonment. He too knew what it was to be an outcast. His name was Tarza, and he walked a lonely path between his own people and the U.S. Army, for whom he sometimes scouted, trusted by neither. He saw in her not an enemy, but a reflection of his own solitude. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves, he made a decision. He couldn't leave her to the scavengers. It was not his way. He carefully, methodically began to prepare a splint from the branches of a nearby creosote bush and strips of leather from his pack. Josephine watched her fear slowly being replaced by a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and sure. Setting the bone was an agony that ripped a scream from her raw throat, but it was a swift and necessary violence. He bound the splint tightly, his hands firm and steady. When it was done, he looked at her again, his dark eyes seeming to weigh her very soul. He spoke again, the English words slow and deliberate. "I am Tarza. You come?" He carefully worked his arms under her, lifting her with an ease that belied his lean frame. The world spun and Josephine cried out as pain flared through her body. But he held her steady. He carried her to his horse, placed her in the saddle, and then mounted behind her, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. As the horse began to walk, taking them away from the arroyo that was meant to be her grave, Josephine Gable, weak and delirious, leaned back against the Apache scout who had saved her. She didn't know where he was taking her or what her fate would be. She only knew that when the world had left her to die, a stranger, an enemy had chosen to show her mercy. Tarza's camp was not a camp at all, but a place. It was a shallow cave carved by wind and water into the side of a red rock canyon, hidden by a screen of ancient junipers, and accessible only by a winding, narrow trail. It was a place of solitude, a place to be unseen. For the first few days, Josephine was barely aware of her surroundings. She was trapped in a fever dream, the infection from her wound and the harshness of the sun having taken their toll. She had vague impressions of Tarza's constant presence, the cool dampness of a cloth on her forehead, the bitter taste of a tea he trickled between her lips, the low murmur of his voice, speaking in the Apache tongue, not to her, but seemingly to the spirits of the cave itself. He was a tireless caretaker. He hunted, bringing back rabbit and quail which he cooked and painstakingly shredded, feeding her small morsels when she had the strength to eat. He changed the dressing on her leg, applying a poultice of crushed leaves that smelled of sage and damp earth. He never spoke English to her during this time. It was as if he had retreated into his own world, and she was just a task to be completed. Josephine's fear of him began to recede, replaced by a profound and humbling gratitude. She was completely at his mercy, yet he had shown her nothing but a solemn, almost ritualistic care. She watched him through half-closed eyelids as he worked. She saw the way he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life without waste. She saw the way he cleaned and fletched his arrows, his long fingers working with meticulous precision. She saw the way he would stand at the mouth of the cave at dawn and dusk, looking out over the vast expanse of the territory, his face a mask of stoic loneliness. When the fever finally broke, she woke one morning to find the world in sharp focus. The air was cool and clean, and the pain in her leg had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. Taza was sitting by the fire, sharpening a knife on a smooth whetstone. He looked up and saw she was awake and lucid. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was a shared awareness between them. He put down his knife. "You are better," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice rough. "Thank you. You saved my life." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and went back to his work. The conversation, it seemed, was over. The days that followed were a slow, quiet dance of recovery and discovery. Communication was a significant barrier. His English was limited to a few dozen words, and she knew nothing of his language. They communicated through gestures, through drawings in the sand, through a shared understanding of basic human needs. She learned that a certain gesture meant water, another meant the fire needed wood, another was his sign for a deer he'd spotted on a distant ridge. She learned his routines. He was gone for hours at a time, scouting or hunting, but he always left water and food within her reach. When he returned, he would bring her things, not just for survival, but small, curious offerings. A brightly colored feather from a jay, a smooth, strangely shaped stone from a riverbed, a sprig of a fragrant herb. It was his way of sharing his world with her. One afternoon, he brought an older Apache woman to the cave. Her name was Nalin. She was wizened and sharp-eyed, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and stern judgment. She looked at Josephine with open suspicion, her gaze lingering on Josephine's pale skin and fair hair. She and Taza spoke for a long time in their own language, her voice sharp and questioning his low and steady. Nalin examined Josephine's leg, her touch rougher than Taza's, but her knowledge was undeniable. She adjusted the splint and applied a fresh, pungent poultice before leaving with a final, disapproving glare. "She does not like me here," Josephine said quietly after the woman had gone. Taza looked out from the cave. "She does not trust what she does not know," he said, one of his longer English sentences. "My people have been hurt by yours." It was a simple, profound truth that left no room for argument. Josephine fell silent, contemplating the vast chasm between their worlds. She was a living embodiment of the people who had brought so much pain to his. How could he not hate her as her leg healed, and she was able to hobble around the cave with the help of a crude crutch Taza had fashioned? She tried to make herself useful. She mended his spare buckskin shirt with a needle and thread from her own small sewing kit she'd miraculously still had in a pocket. She learned to grind mesquite beans into a coarse flour. She kept the fire a small, nearly smokeless flame he had taught her to build, fed and burning steadily. One evening her hand went to the locket at her neck. She opened it to look at Jedediah's face, a ritual of grief she performed daily. The clasp, damaged in her fall, was weak, and the locket slipped from her fingers, falling to the stone floor. The tiny hinge broke completely. She cried out in dismay. It was her last link to her husband, to her past, and now it was broken. Tarza, seeing her distress, came over. He picked up the two halves of the locket and the tiny portrait that had fallen out. He looked at the face of the man in the painting, then back at Josephine's tear-streaked face. Without a word, he took the pieces and sat by the fire. For the next 2 hours, using the tip of his knife and a piece of sinew, he worked with intense concentration. It was a delicate, frustrating task, far removed from skinning a deer or tracking a man. But he persisted. Josephine watched, holding her breath, as he fashioned a tiny new hinge from a sliver of flattened metal he'd scavenged from a broken canteen buckle. It was crude, but it was functional. He handed the repaired locket back to her. She snapped it shut. It held. She opened it again. Jedediah's face looked out at her. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were not of sorrow. She looked at Tarza, at this silent, stoic man who had saved her, healed her, and now had repaired the last broken piece of her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded his face, unreadable in the firelight. But Josephine saw something new in his eyes, a connection. He had not just fixed a piece of metal, he had understood its importance. In that small, silent act of kindness, a fragile bridge was built across the vast canyon that separated their two worlds. The seasons began to turn. The brutal heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden days of autumn. The canyon walls, once a uniform red, were now painted with the vibrant yellows of the cottonwoods that grew along the hidden creek bed. Josephine's leg healed, leaving her with a permanent limp, but granting her freedom. She could walk, explore the small area around the cave, and contribute more fully to their shared existence. The limp was a constant reminder of her past, of the betrayal that had brought her here. But with each passing day, the memory of Silas's cruelty faded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of her new life with Tarza. Their language barrier slowly eroded. She taught him more English words, pointing to objects and repeating their names. Sky, stone, fire, water. He in turn taught her the Apache names for the plants and animals, and more importantly, for the concepts that shaped his world. He taught her the word Jiu for mountain, and how it meant more than just rock and earth. It was a sacred living entity. He taught her Ngosun for stars, explaining that they were the campfires of the ancestors watching over them. She learned to see the world through his eyes. A hawk circling overhead wasn't just a bird. It was a messenger, its cry carrying meaning. The direction of the wind wasn't just weather. It was a sign of a coming change, a warning or a promise. She had spent her life trying to tame the land, to fence it in and bend it to her will. Tarza lived as a part of it, in harmony with its cycles and its power. Their companionship deepened into a comfortable, unspoken intimacy. They worked together, gathering firewood, foraging for roots and berries, preparing meals over the fire. In the evenings, they would sit in silence, watching the vast, star-dusted sky. The silence was never empty. It was filled with a mutual respect and a growing affection that needed no words. Josephine found herself noticing small things about him, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when something amused him, the rare, soft smile that would touch his lips when she finally mastered a task. He'd taught her the deep well of sadness that sometimes surfaced in his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. She learned he was an outcast because he had tried to argue for peace with the white soldiers, a position that had earned him the scorn of the more militant members of his Chiricahua band. He was in his own way, as alone as she was. One night, after a particularly beautiful sunset had painted the clouds in hues of rose and violet, Taza turned to her. "Josephine," he said, his use of her full name feeling strangely formal. "Your leg is strong. You can walk far." She knew what he was implying. Fort Bowie was a week's walk to the east. He was telling her she was free to go. The thought sent a surprising jolt of panic through her. Go where back to a world that had discarded her, to face the pity or suspicion of strangers, to a life where she would be a crippled widow with nothing to her name. The life she had here, as hard as it was felt, more real, more honest than anything that awaited her back in the civilized world. "I have nowhere to go," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "My family, they are gone, or they wished me gone." Taza was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the rising moon. "This is no life for a white woman," he said, his voice heavy. "A hard life. A lonely life." "I am not lonely here," she replied, and the truth of the words surprised her. With him, she wasn't lonely. My life before, that was lonely. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the pale moonlight. He saw no fear, no deception. He saw the same quiet strength he had first glimpsed when he found her broken in the arroyo. He reached out and gently took her hand. His hand was calloused and strong, but his touch was tender. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "With me. This is your home now, if you will have it." It wasn't a proposal in the way her people would understand it. There was no ring, no preacher, no talk of property or dowry. It was something far simpler and more profound. It was a statement of fact, an offering of belonging. He was offering her a place in his world, a place by his side. Tears welled in Josephine's eyes. She thought of Jedediah, of the life they had planned, and a pang of grief shot through her. But that life was over. Taza had not replaced Jedediah, but he had healed the wound of his loss. He had given her a new life when her old one was stolen. She tightened her grip on his hand. "Yes," she whispered, "I will have it." They sealed their promise, not with a kiss, but with a shared look under the watchful eyes of the Ngosun, the ancestral stars. There was no ceremony, no witnesses, save for the ancient rocks and the whispering wind. It was a marriage of two survivors, two outcasts from different worlds who had found a home, not in a place, but in each other. That night, for the first time, Josephine didn't dream of the past she had lost. She dreamed of the future she was building one quiet day at a time in a hidden canyon with the Apache scout who had become her husband. Nearly a year passed. It was a year of peace, of learning, of love solidifying in the quiet crucible of the wilderness. Josephine's skin darkened under the sun, and her body grew strong and wiry. Her limp remained, but it no longer hindered her. She could track a jackrabbit find water and read the signs of the weather, as well as any settler. She and Taza were a unit, a self-contained world of two. The memory of her former life had become like a distant, half-forgotten story, read in a book long ago. But the past is never truly buried in the desert. It is merely preserved, waiting for the wind to uncover it. In the dusty, ramshackle settlement of Redemption Gulch, a good 2 days' ride from the canyon, Silas Kane had established himself. He had filed the claim on the plot of land that was to have been Jedediah and Josephine's telling a tragic but convincing story of a fatal accident and a hurried, heartbroken burial on the trail. He was seen as a grieving brother, a man of fortitude who had carried on in the face of terrible loss. But Silas was a man gnawed by a private unease. His greed was not satisfied by the land alone. Before he died, Jedediah had written to him of a discovery, a small hidden seam of gold he'd stumbled upon in the foothills while scouting ahead of the wagon train. It wasn't a motherlode, but it was enough to make a man rich. Jedediah, ever cautious, had drawn a map, but he told Silas he'd hidden it in the safest place I know. Silas had searched Jedediah's belongings, the wagon, everything. He found nothing. He became obsessed, convinced that Josephine must have known where it was. Her death, so convenient at the time, now felt like a loose end. What if she'd had it on her person? What if someone had found her? His paranoia was stoked by whispers and rumors that drifted into Redemption Gulch with the occasional trapper or prospector. Tales of a ghost white woman living with a renegade Apache scout in the Dragoon Mountains. Most dismissed it as campfire fantasy, but for Silas the description was too close, the location too specific. The thought that Josephine was alive and possibly in possession of the map was a poison in his blood. He had to know for sure, and if she was alive, she couldn't be allowed to remain that way. Her existence threatened not only his claim to the land, but also his freedom. He was a pillar of the community, but he had left a woman to die. That was a hanging offense. He assembled a small group of men, feeding them a carefully constructed story. "My sister-in-law Josephine," he'd say, his voice thick with false emotion. "I fear she wasn't killed in the fall. I believe she was taken by an Apache brave. I've heard whispers she's alive, being held against her will. It is my Christian duty to rescue her." He chose his men carefully. 2 were hired gunsmen named Courtman and Beale, who cared only for coin. The 3rd was a man from their original wagon party, Daniel Peterson, the husband of the kind-eyed Martha. Daniel was a weak-willed man, haunted by his complicity in leaving Josephine behind. Silas played on his guilt, convincing him this rescue was a chance at redemption. He didn't mention the gold. That secret was his alone. Meanwhile, in the canyon, an unseasonable drought had settled over the land. The creek had slowed to a trickle, and game was becoming scarce. Taza grew watchful, his senses on high alert. One afternoon, he returned from a long scouting trip, his face grim. "Riders," he said, his voice low. 4 of them. White men. They cut a fresh trail a few miles south. They move like they are hunting, but not for deer. A cold knot of fear formed in Josephine's stomach. Who would be out here? Taza looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a grim certainty. The past does not forget, Josephine. Someone is looking for you. That evening, as they prepared a meager meal, Josephine's hand went to the locket at her throat. She had been cleaning it the day before, polishing the tarnished silver with a soft piece of buckskin. As she worked the cloth into the grooved edge of the casing, she'd felt a small tear in the thin velvet lining inside. Curious, she'd picked at it with her needle. Tucked deep within the padding, almost invisible, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of oiled parchment. She had unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a map drawn in Jedediah's familiar script, a series of landmarks, a split boulder, a trio of saguaros, a dry waterfall, led to a spot marked with a small X. And at the bottom, a note for my Josephine. Our beginning. The gold. It wasn't about the land. It was about this. Silas must have known. He hadn't left her to die just because she was a burden. He had left her to die so he could claim everything. And now he was coming back to finish the job. She showed the map to Taza. He studied it, his expression unreadable. This is why he comes. Taza said, his voice flat. He pointed to the map. This paper is your death warrant. He looked from the map to her face, his gaze softening. He does not know you are no longer the woman he left in the dirt. The fear in Josephine's heart was still there, but it was now overlaid with a cold, hard anger. Silas Cain had taken her husband, her home, and had tried to take her life. He would not take this new life she had built with Tarza. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Tarza looked towards the mouth of the cave, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "They will not find this place easily, but they will search. We cannot run forever. We must make them stop." He picked up his bow and a quiver of arrows, his movements deliberate and calm. "Stay here. Keep the fire low. I will watch the trail." As he slipped out of the cave and melted into the twilight, Josephine clutched the locket. Jedediah had meant for the map to be their future. Now it was a beacon, drawing a monster from her past. But Tarza was right. She was not the same woman. The helpless widow was gone. In her place was a survivor, and she would fight to protect the only home she had left. For 2 days, a tense quiet hung over the canyon. Tarza moved like a ghost along the ridges, tracking the progress of Silas and his men. He would return to the cave silently, his reports brief and grim. "They have found the creek. They follow it north. They are slow, but they are certain." Josephine prepared. She sharpened knives. She filled every available water skin. She packed a small bag with dried meat and medicinal herbs. The fear was a cold stone in her gut, but she moved with a purpose she had never known. She was no longer waiting to be rescued or victimized. She was a participant in her own survival. On the 3rd morning, Tarza returned just after dawn. "They will be at the canyon mouth by midday," he said. "The horses cannot make the narrow trail to this cave. They will come on foot. We will not be trapped here." His plan was simple and dangerous. They would abandon the cave and use his intimate knowledge of the labyrinthine canyon system to lead their pursuers into a trap. There was one place, a narrow passage known as Windtalker's Choke, where the trail became a treacherous ledge barely wide enough for one man. It was there they would make their stand. They left the cave that had been their home, taking only what they could carry. As Josephine took one last look at the place where she had been reborn, a wave of sadness washed over her. Tarza touched her arm gently. "A home is a person, Josephine," he said quietly, "not a place." The journey to the choke was arduous. Tarza set a relentless pace, forcing Josephine to use every ounce of her newfound strength and stamina. Her limp ached, but she pushed the pain away, focusing only on placing her feet where Tarza had placed his. They moved with silence and speed, the hunters becoming the hunted. They reached Windtalker's Choke with an hour to spare. It was a terrifying place. A sheer cliff dropped hundreds of feet on one side of the narrow ledge, while the other side was a smooth, unclimbable rock wall. The wind howled through the passage, a mournful, eerie sound that gave the place its name. "You will hide there," Tarza instructed, pointing to a small alcove in the rock face, about 50 yards past the narrowest point of the ledge. "Do not show yourself, no matter what you hear." He handed her a knife. "Only if they pass me." He then began his preparations. He loosened rocks above the ledge, creating a small potential rock slide. He wedged his bow and a few arrows in a crack near the entrance to the choke, a final resort. His primary weapon would be surprise, and the terrain itself. The weight was agonizing. The wind seemed to whisper her name, mocking her. Then she heard them. The crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices. Silas Cain came first, his face red with exertion and frustration. Behind him were the 2 hired guns, Cortman and Beale, their rifles held at the ready. Last was Daniel Peterson, looking pale and frightened. "Spread out," Silas commanded. "The tracks end here. He must have a den in these rocks like a damned coyote." Tarza waited until they were on the narrowest part of the ledge. Then he stepped out from behind a boulder, appearing as if from the stone itself. He stood before them, holding only a knife blocking their path. Courtman and Beale immediately raised their rifles. "Hold it." Silas snapped a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, the savage himself. "Where is she, boy? Where is my sister?" Tarza remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on Silas. "He doesn't speak English, the dumb animal," Beale sneered. "He speaks it," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "He's just stubborn. We can fix that. Give me the woman and we'll let you live." Tarza's voice, when it came, was as cold and sharp as the wind. "She is not yours to take." The men were visibly startled. Silas recovered first. "So the animal has a tongue. It won't do you any good. There are 4 of us, and 1 of you." "There is 1 of me," Tarza said calmly, "and there is the mountain. It does not favor you." Enraged by his defiance, Silas gave a sharp nod to Courtman. "Wound him, in the leg." The rifle shot echoed like a thunderclap in the narrow canyon. Tarza cried out and staggered, a dark stain spreading across his buckskin leggings. He stumbled back, leaning against the rock wall for support. From her hiding place, Josephine stifled a scream, her hand flying to her mouth. She had to obey. She had to trust him. "Now," Silas said, stepping forward cautiously. "Let's try this again. Where is she?" Tarza pushed himself off the wall. With a roar that was pure fury, he lunged forward. He ignored Courtman and Beale, his target, solely Silas. He was fast, even with the wound, but the bullet had taken its toll. Beale brought the butt of his rifle down hard on Tarza's shoulder, sending him to his knees. Courtman kicked Tarza's knife away, and it skittered over the edge of the cliff. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Not so mighty now, are you?" He drew a long-barreled pistol from his belt and aimed it at Tarza's head. "For the last time." Suddenly, Daniel Peterson, who had been standing frozen at the back, cried out. "Silas, no. This wasn't the deal. We were here to rescue her. Not this." "Shut up, you fool," Silas snarled, not taking his eyes off Tarza. That brief distraction was all Tarza needed. With a surge of adrenaline, he swept his good leg out, knocking Silas's feet from under him. Silas tumbled backward, his pistol flying from his hand and firing as it hit the rock, the bullet whining off into the sky. Everything descended into chaos. Beale moved to stomp on Tarza, but Tarza rolled, grabbing a fistful of rock and dust and flinging it into the man's face. Courtman tried to aim his rifle again, but Daniel Peterson finally spurred to action. By his conscience, lunged at him, trying to wrestle the gun away. This was Josephine's moment. She could no longer hide. She burst from the alcove, knife in hand, screaming a wild, raw cry of fury. Silas, scrambling to his feet, saw her. His face went slack with shock, then twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You!" he spat. "You're alive. The map. Give me the map." He lunged for her. But this was not the weak woman he had left in the arroyo. She sidestepped his clumsy charge, her limp forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. He stumbled past her towards the cliff's edge. Meanwhile, Daniel had managed to knock Courtman's rifle from his hands. The 2 men were grappling their bodies dangerously close to the precipice. Beale, blinking the dust from his eyes, saw Josephine and started towards her. Tarza, seeing the danger, shoved the rock he had prepared. It wasn't an avalanche, but a shower of smaller stones rained down on the ledge. Beale was struck in the head and staggered back, stunned. Silas had regained his footing and turned back to Josephine. "That gold is mine, you witch!" he roared, grabbing for the locket at her throat. Josephine didn't hesitate. She brought her knife up in a swift, desperate arc, slashing his arm. He bellowed in pain and surprise, his grip loosening. At that exact moment, the struggle between Daniel and Courtman reached its terrible conclusion. Their combined weight and momentum sent them both tumbling over the edge, their screams swallowed by the wind. The sight broke something in Silas. His backup was gone. He was wounded. He looked at Josephine, at the fierce, determined woman holding a bloody knife. He looked at the wounded Apache struggling to his feet. His greed was finally overcome by his terror. He scrambled away back the way he had come, slipping and sliding on the treacherous path, a pathetic, broken man. Josephine rushed to Tarza's side. "Are you all right?" she cried, helping him up. "It is a wound," he said, gritting his teeth against the pain. "It will heal." He looked down the empty ledge, then at her. His eyes were filled with pain, but also with an immense pride. "You fought." "We fought," she corrected, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his leg. In the silence that followed, broken only by the wind, they held each other, two survivors on a lonely ledge, their past finally and violently exercised. The journey back to the cave was slow and agonizing. Tarza leaned heavily on Josephine, each step a testament to his endurance. She was his strength now, her slight frame supporting his weight, her resolve unwavering. They worked as one their shared ordeal, having forged their bond into something unbreakable. Back in the quiet sanctuary of their home, Josephine tended to his wound. She cleaned it with the last of their clean water and packed it with the medicinal herbs Nalin had taught her to use. Tarza bore the pain in stoic silence, his eyes never leaving her face, watching her with a look of profound love and respect. Daniel Peterson and Courtman were gone, claimed by the canyon. Beale had fled with Silas. The immediate threat was over, but a shadow remained. "He will not stop," Tarza said a few days later as he began to regain some of his strength. "Silas, a man like that, his hate will burn until he is ash. He will tell others that I am a renegade who holds a white woman captive. They will send soldiers." Josephine knew he was right. Silas would twist the story to save his own skin, painting himself as the victim and Tarza as the villain. Their peace was shattered. This place, once a haven, was now a liability. "Then we leave her," Josephine said, the decision forming in her mind with absolute clarity. "We leave this place. We go north, deeper into the mountains, to a place they will never find." Tarza looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You would do this? Leave everything again? There is a fort, soldiers, your people. You could be safe." "My people left me to die," she said, her voice firm, devoid of self-pity. "You are my people now, Tarza. You are my safety. My home is with you. I don't care where it is." She took out the locket and opened it, looking at Jedediah's tiny portrait. Then she removed the map. She held it over the small fire. For a moment, she hesitated. This was her inheritance, the source of all the pain, but also the promise of a different kind of life, a life of wealth and ease. She looked at Tarza, at his strong, quiet face, at the man who had shown her what true wealth was. It was not gold hidden in the earth. It was loyalty. It was courage. It was a shared glance across a fire on a cold night. Without another thought, she dropped the map into the flames. The parchment curled, blackened, and turned to ash. With it, the last ghost of her old life vanished. The legacy of Jedediah's gold and Silas's greed was gone, reduced to nothing. A slow smile touched Tarza's lips. He reached out and took her hand. "The gold was a heavy stone, Josephine. Now we are free." A week later, just as Tarza was able to walk without her aid, they saw a dust cloud in the distance. A patrol of cavalry, just as he had predicted. They were not searching frantically. They were moving with the slow certainty of a group following directions. Silas had done his work. That night, under the cover of darkness, they left the canyon for good. They carried little traveling light and fast. They moved north towards the high, rugged country where the peaks touched the clouds, a land few white men had ever dared to enter. It was a hard journey, but it was not a flight of fear. It was an emigration of hope. They were not running from something, but towards something, a future they would build themselves on their own terms, far from the greed and betrayal of the world they had left behind. As they made their camp on the first night of their journey on a high mesa, overlooking the vast expanse of the territory, Josephine stood beside Taza and looked up at the endless blanket of stars, the Ngosun, the campfires of the ancestors. She no longer felt like a stranger under their light. She was home. She had come west, seeking a plot of land to call her own. She had lost a husband, been betrayed by family, and left to die. But in the heart of that harsh and unforgiving wilderness, she had found something far more valuable. She had found a warrior's spirit within herself, and she had found a life and a love as vast and as true as the land itself. She slipped her hand into Taza's, and together they watched the dawn of their new beginning. And so the story of Josephine Gable and the Apache scout Taza fades from the official record, becoming a whisper on the mountain wind. Theirs is a testament to the fact that the human heart can endure the most bitter betrayals and find a home in the most unexpected of places. It's a story that reminds us that family is not always the blood you are born with, but the people who show up when the rest of the world has walked away. Their love, forged in survival and sealed by courage, was a treasure far greater than any gold hidden in the earth. It was a life built from the ashes of what was into something stronger, truer and wilder than any of them could have ever imagined. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. If this story of resilience and unlikely love moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more emotional stories that bring history to life. Your support allows us to keep telling these tales. Let us know in the comments what part of Josephine and Taza's story resonated with you the most. Until next time, walk tall and keep your fire bright.